spoke for us at our spring meeting as well. I don't know how many of you were there for that one. Good showing, all right.
I was there.
You were there. So many of you have met him, but I'm going to run through the bio real quick for you, just so everybody's familiar, and then we're going to turn him loose. And you technically have an hour, but the room's here for a while. So.
Okay.
All right, Robert Brown has served as field coordinator and regional field director for John Birch Society, and today is national spokesman on constitutional issues. He is best known across the nation for his lectures on the Constitution, and has produced 6 of his lectures as a DVD series known as The Constitution is the Solution, which is gaining popularity nationwide. If you haven't checked that out yet, check that out. After viewing just 2 of these lectures, a constitutional attorney from New Jersey remarked, "I studied constitutional law under one of the most outstanding constitutional law professors in America, and I have learned more from the 2 DVDs that I saw than I did from the professor."
Oh, wow.
Mr.
Thank you.
Brown and his family reside in Utah. Popular constitutional speaker, he has lectured for many liberty-minded organizations throughout the country and testified as an expert witness on constitutional issues before numerous state legislatures, and has been a guest on countless radio and television programs. Recently, Mr. Brown has conducted numerous tours across the country, presenting the harsh reality of Convention of States, showing why irrefutable historical precedent suggests a convention held in today's political environment would likely be national suicide. And if you missed that one at our last meeting, definitely check into more of his videos. All right, so Robert Brown.
Thank you. So regarding the Constitution is the solution, there is a QR code there where you can watch it free online, get access to the class handouts and workbook and things of that nature. I like to start my story by telling on someone that many in this room know pretty well by the name of Paul Venable, where probably, I'm guessing somewhere in the range of 20 plus years ago now, I don't even recall now, he invited me to a class on the Constitution, which he informed me was going to be held in my living room. True story. And so I showed up. He had actually arranged it with my wife, but separately gave me an invitation to it. And the reason I start there is because that's really where my interest in being politically active in the defense of freedom was born. As we went through this course, it was 12 weeks, and there were some interesting people in that room, one of whom we went on to help him win a seat in the state legislature in Idaho. I was living in Caldwell, Idaho at the time, and he's still there to this day. And David, I was trying to figure out where I know you from. Was it in Idaho or was it in Montana where I first met you?
It might have been Montana, but it could have been Idaho. I'm guessing it was Belgrade or
Yeah, Bozeman area.
Bozeman area.
That's what I was thinking.
July 2009, some Oath Keepers lectures that I gave.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's where it is. There we go.
How about that?
I was the field coordinator for the John Birch Society at the time.
I didn't know Paul then. He and I are friends now, but he's
Yeah.
the one who did the right
Well, Paul's the one that got me started into all this, got me into all this trouble. And really, the most important things it did for me, number one, is it created a real respect and passion to learn the Constitution. Number two, and this one's the shocker, so everyone stay sitting down so you don't fall over when you hit this one. That is, we're not really following the Constitution anymore. I know you hadn't noticed that, so I hate to be the bearer of bad news. But number three, the most important part is that if we were to be following the Constitution as written, as intended, it would solve the vast majority of problems our nation is facing today. So I'm going to begin today by illustrating what I refer to as the power of the Constitution. And there's so many angles I could hit this with, but in the interest of giving only one lecture tonight, rather than being here till midnight, I could. I'm going to illustrate it with a couple quotes from George Washington. Before we have the Constitution versus after. Notice the year here. This is February 3rd, 1787, just months before the convention formed the Constitution. And here we were, we've declared our independence, we're living as an independent nation of states, and we're collapsing. This one simple statement: if any person had told me there would have been such a formidable rebellion as exists, I would have thought him fit for a madhouse. If you told me ahead of time, upon winning our war for independence, that we'd be in such chaos, I would have thought you're crazy. Now, after about 2 years of living under the Constitution, he says almost exactly the same statement in reverse. This time, again, note the year 1791. So it's about 2 years of the Constitution actually being used. He says, tranquility reigns. Our public credit stands on that high ground which 3 years ago it would have been considered a species of madness to have foretold. Again, same thing. If you told me ahead of time, I would have thought you're crazy. To me, that's one of the most simple ways of explaining and demonstrating how powerful actually obeying the Constitution is for the prosperity of our country. I'm going to use one more example. This one I chose partially because David Gilley gave a reference to nobody understands the militia clauses. And Dr. Edwin Vieira, I consider my mentor on that topic. He's crazy about how much he knows on those things. I love it. I watched a lecture he gave, I think it was like 6 hours, on it was called The Purse and the Sword. You know that one? And just going into Congress's power over money, spending, and power over military. And he spent a large portion explaining the militia. And it caused me to look into something here. Here's what I did. Just a curiosity. What if we were actually obeying the militia clauses as intended? Where under the original understanding, militia was who? Every able-bodied man between an age range. And I'm going to use 16 to 65. That was roughly what they all kind of tended to be, somewhere around that. So every able-bodied man between this age range. And so I said, what if in every state we had an active militia of every able-bodied man between the ages of 16 and 65? And let's assume that 10% are not able-bodied. That may be a high estimate, I don't know. And we're only going to count men in this. Because, if we counted women, it would be roughly double. So let's just keep it conservative. How many people would be in each militia? And I'm going to compare this to the largest 16 militaries in the world. This should be interesting, huh? So here's the number of people, number of men in each military. China, obviously, 2 million man military is number one. All the way down to Colombia with a 293,000. And I ranked just a few states, just handpicked a few, starting with Montana, where I had lived a few years ago. Montana is our 43rd largest state by population, and it would edge out Colombia as being the 16th largest military power in the world. Little Montana would be. That surprised me. That's pretty significant. And as we go up the line to some of our larger states, Utah, where I now live, Utah would be ahead of Russia with about a 1 million man militia. That's staggering, isn't it? Now, I'm going to pause for a moment. Everyone's familiar with the second half of the Second Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but we tend to gloss over the first half or even diminish it. I think it's the most important part. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. When we understand that that includes everyone, it doesn't threaten our right to bear arms in any way, because it includes everybody. But a well-regulated militia established like this, how secure would we actually be? Let's move on to the next state that I chose. Utah, 5th largest military power in the world, and it's only our 30th largest state. Moving on to South Carolina, would actually edge ahead of the United States and roughly tie with India as the 2nd largest military in the world. Wow. Indiana, our 23rd largest state. It gets better. Indiana, our 17th largest state, would be roughly tied with China. Wow. Are we surprised yet? This floored me. And then we go to our top 3 largest states. Florida, 6 million, 3 times China. Texas, 8.5 million. And California, now this is assuming the men actually know they're men. Granted. And there might be some mixing up there. Anyway, 12 million. Estimated 90% of the men by demographics between the ages of 16 and 65 gives us 12 million man militia in China, over China. This is like 6 times China's army. You're starting to feel pretty secure by now? That threat of a 2 million man army in China? We have 17 states that match or beat that. Wow. And I could go on. This is a topic I get pretty passionate about. I got some of that passion from our friend Dr. Edwin Vieira Jr. The more you learn, the more fun this is. I'm going to now examine another angle here. As I look around the world, I was listening to a speech by a gentleman who lived in Cuba when it fell to communism. And it really got me thinking about how many times that's happened in the world's history. How a country was relatively free and then overnight they become communist. And it caused me to ask the question, why has that not happened to the United States yet? I mean, you might argue somewhat it has, but not completely. We have some semblance of elections, sort of. How did Russia, China, Cuba, how did they all fall? How did they become communist? And I would sum it up as one major thing is a dedicated Marxist came to power. We were told Fidel Castro is not a communist until he came to power, then he admitted he was. It's that once that person, that one individual, gains control over that country as its leader, they can flip the whole country into communism immediately. And why has that not happened in the United States? Have we ever had a president that you might consider a dedicated Marxist? The answer is yes. Several times, yes. And so why did that not happen here? And I would say it is because of the power of the Constitution. Specifically, I would say it's the structure of the Constitution that when someone comes to power as the president of the United States and leader of the free world and whatever else you want to call it, he doesn't really come to that much power, despite the fact that they've usurped a tremendous amount of power through the years. Even so, we still have separation of powers. We recognize that the president is not supposed to be creating law. And when Obama said, I have a pen and a phone, and if Congress won't act, I will, the reason we remember that is because there was such an outcry. Because as little as we know about the Constitution, we knew that wasn't right. We still separate the powers between those who create the law, those who implement the law, executive, and those who judge against the law, the judicial courts. And then the division of powers between federal, state, and local. This constitutional structure is really why we still have any semblance of freedom. Dividing power vertically and horizontally into many different sections. And so to change us into a Marxist state, they who want that need a structural change to the Constitution. Is that agreed? Is there anyone going around the country right now talking about we need a structural change to the Constitution? Ken Ivory in Utah, Convention of States, Mark Meckler, Michael Ferris. By the way, one of my claims to fame is that I have had debates scheduled with Mark Meckler and Michael Ferris on several occasions until they learned it was me they were debating, and every time they back out as soon as they find out it's me. That happened to me 1 month ago with Michael Ferris, where he was scheduled to, yet again, go to a debate, and the person he was debating said, you know who'd really be better to fill my position is Robert Brown. Called me, would you be willing to debate Michael Ferris? Absolutely. But I'll tell you what will happen. And you ought to let him know, so he doesn't just show up and get flat-footed, that it'll be me he's debating. And then watch how quickly he heads for the door. They're like, oh yeah, well, we'll see. They wrote me back the next day. Yep, exactly like you said. I didn't believe you at first, but they want a structural change to the Constitution. That should be a huge red flag. Yeah. And very typically, most of those that are pushing that angle, that we need to change the Constitution through a Convention of States, Article 5 Convention, whatever they're calling it this year, they typically also slander the idea of nullification. We're going to get into that a little bit today too. So nullification. We're going to start by talking about just kind of defining terms. Daniel Webster says it'll be the solemn duty of the state governments to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. And these are among the objects for which the state governments exist. This is why we left a state structure in place, is so that they can be a barrier against abuse of power. Now notice he's using the word interpose. Interpose is a larger term, it's a larger umbrella, one item underneath it is nullification. There are other forms of interposition besides just nullification. I'm going to demonstrate one of my favorite stories of interposition. And it comes from this great book. Have you ever read this one, The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates? In this book, it tells a story about Emperor Caligula and his local governor in Jerusalem, Publius Petronius. In 39 AD, Caligula ordered a larger-than-life statue of Emperor Caligula to be created and placed in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. How well do you think they received that? They recognized this would be a desecration of our temple. And so they were very upset over this idea. They went to Petronius and pled with him, please do not defile our temple by putting this statue to a false god within our temple. And he heard their cries and recognized the justness of their cause. In fact, I'm going to read to you just a little bit of the transcription of what he'd said, obviously translated to English as recorded, but he says, I do not think it is just to have such a regard for my own safety and honor to refuse to sacrifice them for your preservation. Do you get what he just said there? I shouldn't prize my safety so much that I'm not willing to sacrifice my life. That's what he's saying. For the justness of your cause. The Jewish leaders were willing to fight and die to try to protect their temple. And that inspired him, who, not a Jew even, put his own life on the line as well to defy the emperor. That astounds me. That's amazing. So in response, Caligula took it very well, I guess, right? Demanded his death. Sent a letter that you are now ordered to have yourself executed. And just after he sent that letter on a ship across the Mediterranean over to Jerusalem, the palace guard killed Caligula. And another letter was sent informing Petronius of Caligula's death. And fortunately, the second ship was faster and got there first. And that saved his life. Isn't that a fascinating story? I love this. Other examples of interposition where, and literally, Petronius, in order to give this speech, he had 2 legions of the Roman army lined up in front of the temple. Jewish leaders are all there ready to defend the temple, to fight if they had to, and he walks out between them, physically demonstrating that he is what stands between them and these armies, and gave that speech. That literally is what interposition is to stand between. To stand between someone and some threat against them. And so another great example of this, I would say, is the Declaration of Independence. When the brave signers of the Declaration of Independence, as it says at the conclusion, and for support of this declaration, with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They recognized they were signing their death warrant. They would be recognized as traitors, tried for treason, executed. This was absolutely interposition. Other examples of historical interposition might include things like the Magna Carta, the Boston Tea Party. We mentioned the Declaration of Independence, but really the entire American Revolution was an act of interposition, people willing to put their lives on the line to protect us against the abuse of King George. And then, of course, there's our favorite example of interposition for those of us who are Christians. That the sacrifice of our Savior Jesus Christ was the ultimate act of interposition, wasn't it? So interposition has a very rich history. Nullification, a more narrow branch of interposition. First, we'll talk about what it is not. It is not sedition or rebellion. It's not seceding from the Union. It's not begging to please let us have our rights. It's not a mere statement of protest. Nullification is boldly enforcing constitutional laws and refusing to enforce unconstitutional laws. According to the founders, as they define and suggest nullification, it's always in this context of when laws are outside the bounds of the Constitution. Ultimately, then, it really is upholding the Constitution. Nullification is nothing more or less than obeying the Constitution. Now, for a deeper understanding of the founders' position on these things, I feel like one of the best places to look is the Federalist Papers. Everyone familiar with the Federalist Papers? These were basically like letters to the editor, written to newspapers of the state of New York, to help the citizens of New York understand this new constitution that had been proposed, to encourage the state of New York to adopt it, to ratify it. And so these 85 papers have been looked at for over 2 centuries now by the courts as some of the best explanation of the real meaning of the Constitution. So it's a great source that way. And here's a bunch of just little tidbits that talk about various solutions to overstepping the bounds. Federalist 44, Madison talks about the ultimate redress we have for our grievances. The means of opposition are powerful and at hand in 46. Back in 44, I like this one. This one's pretty familiar. The people who can, by the election of more faithful representatives, annul the acts of the usurpers. We would call that elections. We all know that elections are one way to get rid of someone that's violating the Constitution, as long as the election's secure. And so on. I won't go into the whole election integrity topic tonight. Again, I could speak on many topics tonight. We could be here till midnight. I love this one, though. Federalist 46, Madison talks about the power of the disquietude of the people. When was the last time you used that word? Last time I used that word was quoting Federalist 46. Disquietude literally just means that your citizens are beginning to speak out against your actions as an elected representative. And if you're hoping for re-election, the more disquietude you have from your constituents, the less your chance of re-election. It's pretty obvious. And so even between elections, expressing our disquietude, I love that word, is a great way of getting their attention, especially if it's not just one of us, if it's not just you by yourself. Have you ever spoken to your representatives and felt like they're ignoring you? Yeah. When we amass more of us together, they have to pay attention. The more of us that simultaneously are calling them about this issue, the more they notice. Okay, now Hamilton. I'm going to take that one off the screen for just a second because before I bring up any quotes from Hamilton, I have to put this in context. If we did a scale of limited government founding fathers to big government founding fathers, where would you put Jefferson? Limited government. Hamilton? Big government. Okay, good. We understand who Hamilton is. So when I bring up a quote from Hamilton, I usually use the phrase, even Hamilton understood this. Even Hamilton advocated this. You understand why. Good. So even Hamilton in Federalist 16 talks about usurpation would require the concurrence of the courts of justice and the body of the people. In other words, we the people would have to be willing to go along with it if they're usurping, if they're going over the bounds of their power. And then my favorite one on this page, also from Hamilton, where he describes that constitutional enforcement requires a people enlightened enough. Let that phrase sink in for just a moment. What's he talking about? A people enlightened enough to distinguish between a legal exercise and illegal usurpation. In other words, a people enlightened enough to know what's constitutional and what is not. That's really what we need today. And way back when Paul Venable invited me to a class on the Constitution, that's what sparked in me was, we don't have a people enlightened enough. And I started doing everything I could to start sharing the Constitution with others, helping people begin to become enlightened enough, eventually leading to me creating the Constitution is the Solution video series. Now to the middle part of the Hamilton quote. As the natural guardians of the Constitution, who? The people are the natural guardians of the Constitution in that context. Again, where does that put the duty here? It's not on Congress. Yeah, they have some duty. But the ultimate duty is, we the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. And you remember when I talked about point number 2, we're not really following the Constitution? Who's to blame? The guardians of the Constitution. We're the referees in this game. It's time we read the rule book and learned how the game's supposed to be played. I'm a little passionate about this. And I love the wording at the end of this. So we, the people, when we are enlightened enough, as the natural guardians, we can throw our weight into the national scale and give it a decided preponderancy. Again, I love the wording in the contest. In other words, we have a greater power than any other branch of government. We, the people, are the fountain of all power, Madison says. Interesting. Now, to learn more about the power and duty that we, the people, have, this is a separate presentation. I'm not going to give all my presentations in one night. So if you want to go onto YouTube and look up The Power of 500, there's a presentation by someone who looks a lot like me, only about 15 years younger and clean-shaven, explaining how we got the Congressman of Montana to stop violating the Constitution in a matter of a few months with a few hundred people. It's a great tool. We'll not cover that tonight. But something that we, the people, can do by holding their feet to the fire in an organized effort. So going on, nullification, defined in the Federalist Papers, Madison talks about schemes of usurpation will be easily defeated by state governments who will be supported by the people. Again, so there's that role of the people. We need to support them and encourage them to do so. But how many of our state governors and legislators know that that's part of their role?
One in Utah.
There's one in Utah. What's that?
He represents me.
Okay.
There's one in Utah. I don't know any others, but there might be 2 or 3. That's not a good ratio.
There aren't very many, we'll just say that. Even in the most conservative, so-called, states across the Union, they don't have a conservative majority in their state legislatures. This one by Madison's very similar. State governments be able to repel the danger, the role of the states in that. Certainly, they do have a very central role there. Again, even Hamilton, and I love this one. If the cooperation of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, the states have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. On that note, in fact, a number of years ago when we had a government shutdown, sound familiar? A number of the states started contacting the federal branches of the federal government saying, so with the government shutdown, we need your instructions on how we shut down all these federal programs. And what that began to reveal is that the vast majority of federal programs are implemented by the states, not the federal government. It requires the states to implement them. Janine.
I have a question because I've come to realize that the 2 greatest problems with the states are, one, the 17th Amendment, but the 16th Amendment, which has allowed, which has made vassals out of the state.
Yeah.
And every person in the state legislature, almost without exception, votes for money and mandates from the federal government on themselves, and that has destroyed
Yep.
the power structure that we had originally between the federal, state, and federal state governments. So
You're begging me to go into another lecture. That's a great point, and I would love to go into that deeper. You're right. The structure of the 16th, 17th Amendment and the Federal Reserve altogether destroyed a major check against federal growth. And in fact, in my Constitution is the Solution lecture series, in lecture number 3 in that series, I go into that structure of those 3 things, how they dismantled a constitutional check against federal growth. Very important issue. The other issue, though, is that the states feel like we need that money. We can't tell them no, or we'll lose the money. And yet, so often, that money is costing them more than it's giving them. In fact, Tom Coburn, I certainly respect him for many good things he did, even though he went on tour with Convention of States towards the end of his life. He can be forgiven. One thing he did really well was back in Oklahoma, he got the states to, let's pave a mile or 2 of highway without federal funds and see how it lines out at the end versus using federal funds, and discovered it actually costs the state a lot less to not use the federal funding. And I wonder how many other areas that would apply to. And so this is part of what we need to help our states recognize is, yes, you can give up that money, and it might save us a lot. A number of years ago when I was on a speech tour in Texas, the Governor Abbott at the time, had just come out in favor of, we need to change the Constitution because while I support the 10th Amendment, there's no teeth in it. There's no way to enforce the Constitution by the parts of the states, so we need a convention to change the Constitution. I totally disagreed. I was actually on tour speaking against that topic, and local media actually came to me saying, well, Governor Abbott just came out saying he's in favor of it. Do you have a response to Governor Abbott? Yes, I do. I have 3 words for Governor Abbott. Stop being complicit. That's your power. You want to put teeth into the states stopping federal usurpation, that's all you need to do. Because as it says here, the states need to just stop taking the federal funds, stop implementing unconstitutional federal programs, just say no. Governor Abbott, you have the power to shut these things down as the executive of Texas. David.
That's exactly right, and I alluded to one honest member of the Utah State House, his name is Mike Peterson, he did just that, he understands that.
And that is,
enforcing the lawlessness yourself.
yeah.
Typical problem there is.
Our states have become so neutered, or at least they think they have, but they still have that power. Yes, even with the 16th and 17th Amendments taking away state power, they still have the power to say no. We'll go into that a little deeper. A couple more here. Refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union, Madison talks about in Federalist 46, but he also takes it one step further than Hamilton does, saying that the states can also create legislative devices to present obstructions, which the federal government would be hardly willing to encounter. Examples of that would be things like, we will arrest any federal agents that come into our state and try to implement this unconstitutional law. And we've seen legislation like that from time to time. That takes a little bit more boldness. But appropriate? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Isn't that what we're seeing now with the states don't want to cooperate with the ICE?
Yes. I want to make a distinction on that. Thanks for bringing that up. For those that didn't hear, he's talking about, is that kind of what the states are doing with ICE right now? Blocking implementation of immigration controls. And true nullification, according to the founders, when they talked about it, was always in the context of enforcing the Constitution, not in just whatever they feel like. In fact, Governor of Wyoming a number of years ago, he spoke out against nullification, saying you can't have the states pick and choose which laws they want to obey. That would lead to chaos. And while I partially agree with him on that, he was saying, for that reason, we can't ever nullify. I'm saying, well, no, is there a defined standard by which we know what states should enforce and what they should not enforce? Is there anywhere written what powers the federal government actually has? Somewhere? Constitution? Yeah. Yeah, it's very clear. Really. Article 1, Section 8 is the primary area where Congress is given the powers for which they have to legislate, and any powers granted to the federal government are included in their legislative power by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the final one. And again, we could go deeper on that one too. But you get the point here is the states have the power. Going into one of the first times, really this is the first time we see any big push for nullification, was in response to the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. And this is a number of different acts, and there were a lot of problems with these constitutionally, one of which was, interestingly, it very clearly declared that it is illegal for any U.S. citizen to speak out against the actions of the president or Congress. Now, at the time, president and vice president didn't run on the same ticket. And so whoever got the most votes was president, whoever got the second most was vice president, which frequently, including at this time, led to president and vice president of opposing parties. The majority of Congress and president were of one party, and the vice president, in this case was Thomas Jefferson, was the odd man out. And guess who didn't have anything mentioned about him in that act? You can say anything you want about the vice president, but it was illegal to speak out against the actions of President Adams and Congress. Is that a problem with the Constitution anywhere? Pretty obviously. And many other problems in the Alien Sedition Acts. And so Jefferson and Madison wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, in which they outlined this concept of the states having not only the right, but the duty to resist unconstitutional law. Jefferson, for example, says the several states who formed that instrument, the Constitution, so the states wrote the Constitution, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction. We created this contract, we have the right to judge if it's being followed. Pretty obvious. And a nullification by those sovereignties, those states, of all unauthorized acts is the rightful remedy. That's a classic statement right there. But he goes on and says, without this right, the states would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. Who are we told today is the final word on what the Constitution says and means? The Supreme Court. One of my favorite statements from Justice Scalia says that the Constitution nowhere establishes that concept. We made it up, referring to the Supreme Court. It's not in the Constitution. They gave themselves that power. Now, who are the natural guardians of the Constitution? We the people, yeah. Who are the judges of whether it's being followed, ultimately? We the people. And secondarily, the states. That's right. Now, report of 1800, Madison, kind of as a follow-up to the 1798 documents, gives another report to his state legislature explaining nullification even further. If the states could not interpose, he says, there will be an end to all relief of usurped power. As well, if you're denying this right of nullification, that would be a plain denial of the fundamental principle upon which our independence was declared. So when you hear someone, like Mark Levin, did I say that out loud? Speaking against the right of nullification, they're literally speaking against the right we had to declare our independence. Wow. Well, that puts him on very different footing, doesn't it? It gives us a different perspective on who's really an Americanist. Someone who believes in our founding fathers' right to break away from Great Britain. Here, this one, he also talks about the states who are parties to the Constitution have the right and are in duty bound to interpose. He's saying this isn't just an option. They have to do this. This is their duty. We're going to get into that duty here next. And this really comes from Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. I'm going to point at two different clauses. We'll start with clause number 3 first. Clause number 3 is the oath of office clause, wherein it requires everyone in any governmental position, whether it's elected or appointed, whether it's national, state, or local, even police, sheriffs, military, and so on, all have to swear an oath of office to what? To uphold the Constitution. And in particular, Madison found this was a very interesting point that he addressed in Federalist 44. Why do our state level government officials have to swear an oath of office to the federal Constitution? What does the federal Constitution have to do with a state legislator or a governor? In Federalist 44, he gives the answer that the members and officers of the state governments will have the essential agency in giving effect to the federal Constitution. So what's their job there? To give effect, to enforce, to make sure the Constitution is in force. That is part of their duty that they swear to when they swear an oath of office to uphold the federal Constitution. Do they know that?
No.
Do we need to help them know that?
Yeah.
We've got a job here, don't we? If you've spent much time in any state legislatures, I've been in many state legislatures around the country, I finally came up with, here's what they must think their oath of office is. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will be subject and subservient to the federal government. I'll support and defend all laws, whether those laws are passed by Congress, the Supreme Court, or the President, because of course they all get to create law, right? Or any of the federal agencies, and will never question their authority to legislate in all matters whatsoever. Is that a pretty good description of what they act as though their oath of office is? That's not quite what their oath of office is it? It's a little bit different. It's not subject and subservience to the federal government. It is something more like this. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And the domestic ones are the real threat, honestly. Rome didn't fall to any foreign foe until they crumbled internally, and we'll be the same. And so when they swear an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, and that conflicts with following what the federal government tells them to do, they now have to choose which one they're going to follow. They can't follow both. Which one did they swear an oath to follow? This is really pretty simple, isn't it? Andrew Jackson, love his passion here. Each public officer who takes an oath to support the Constitution swears that he will support it as he understands it, and not as it is understood by others, even if that's the Supreme Court. No one of us in government is bound by the opinion of another. No one is bound to obey what the Supreme Court tells us the Constitution means. In fact, when it comes to judicial supremacy, I have a question. Which one is supreme over the other? Is the Supreme Court supreme over the Constitution and able to define it, or are they subject to the Constitution, having to swear an oath to it? Which one? They do swear an oath to it, right? Yeah. And their position is created by it. They don't create it. So creator versus that was created. They are over or beneath the Constitution. They've come to believe they're above it. How can they be above it if it's what created them? How can they be above it if they have to swear an oath to uphold it? The absurdity of logic is so plain and obvious. Okay, so now the other clause in Article 6. Article 6, Clause 2 is the supremacy clause. And I just heard this on a podcast show earlier this week, someone talking about this very perspective, and it infuriates me every time I hear it. The supremacy clause tells us that all federal law is supreme. When it comes to a contest between the states and federal, the federal always wins because of the supremacy clause. Because here's what the supremacy clause says. The Constitution and laws of the United States, which shall be passed by any federal branch, shall be the supreme law of the land. That's not what it says. That's what they want you to believe it says. And I like to point out, there's a few words here that have significant meaning. It says made in pursuance thereof. Only federal law that is made in pursuance, in following thereof, referring to the Constitution, is supreme. Really? That is such a radical idea today, and yet even the big government advocate of our founding fathers, even Alexander Hamilton, wrote one of the best rebuttals of that idea I've seen. Personally, I think this is the best thing he ever wrote. Federalist 33. Acts of the federal government which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers are merely acts of usurpation. That means theft of power. And will deserve to be treated as such. How do you do that? Yeah. You ignore it, you refuse to implement it, or you even pass laws to block and arrest those that try to implement it. You mean that Alexander Hamilton was supporting the idea of nullification? Now, granted, you have to recognize there are really two Hamiltons. How many believe that? I know David does. There are really two Hamiltons. There's the Hamilton who advocated for the Constitution, such as in the Federalist Papers, and he wrote some great things in there. And then there was the Hamilton after the Constitution was ratified who kind of reversed himself on a lot of those points. Yeah. Hamilton's just a mixed bag. I love the guy in some ways, and I really had some struggles with him in others. But yeah, anyway, moving forward, deserve to be treated as such. So nullification is all throughout the Federalist Papers. I've shown you quite a few examples today. It's all over the place. Because one of the biggest concerns, you got to recognize, we were transitioning from the Articles of Confederation, which was a purely federal form of government, which meant no national enforcement power. The federal government could request, but they couldn't require. And we're transitioning to the federal government's now going to have some, what they refer to as national power. National, this comes from the 1787 convention where they debated whether or not they had the authority to create national enforcement power. And again, I'm kind of venturing into another one of my speeches. But they recognize that we're granting some actual power to the central government. They're very leery of this. And so one of the most common concerns that the founders had to address in the Federalist Papers was many different ways in which, what happens when this power we've given to the federal government starts getting out of hand, which is why so many places they've addressed it here. So now let's get into some myths, nullification myths. By the way, I refer to the Constitutional Convention, Convention of States, people are always talking about Article 5 as the solution. I say Article 6 is the solution. Article 6, the nullification through oath of office requires you to hold the Constitution, and only those laws that are made in pursuance of the Constitution should be enforced. That is nullification. Nullification is in the Constitution with a proper understanding of Article 6. So now, nullification myths. First one, nullification is extra-constitutional. It's not in the Constitution. Have we debunked that one pretty well now? I think so. Nullification was used to protect slavery. Mark Levin likes to use that one. It's a lie. We'll get into that in a moment. And Madison opposed nullification. Now we know that in the 1798 he was endorsing it. He generally used the word interposition. He very rarely spoke of it in nullification, although he did later. So we've already debunked the first one. We'll just address the next two. First of all, nullification was used to protect slavery is a lie, honestly. In fact, just the other way around. Some fabulous history here. I find this really interesting. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, requiring runaway slaves in the North to be returned to the South. And here's how it worked. It actually, I think it says here in my notes, violated due process. Well, I'll have to explain some of that. For example, if you were accused of being a runaway slave, your trial, you were forbidden from testifying on your own behalf. That poses a problem, doesn't it? And number two, the judge is incentivized to rule against you by doubling his pay on any of those cases that he ruled that you are a runaway slave. Do you think there's any problem with that? The fugitive slave law was pretty bad. And upon its passage, 13 northern states passed laws nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And, in particular, I love the language of this one from Michigan, where it says, every person who shall wrongfully and maliciously be seized, procured to be seized, and so on, anyone that basically violates us saying we're not enforcing the fugitive slave law, shall pay a fine not less than $500, which back then was a lot of money, nor more than $1,000, and shall be imprisoned 5 years. Not maybe or up to, it's they shall be imprisoned for 5 years. Who does that apply to? First two words. Every person? Does that mean every person, including federal agents? Yeah. Yes, it does. Guess how many fugitive slaves were returned from Michigan? None. 0. That's exactly right. They didn't dare do it. Because the states boldly stood up and said no, and not only refused to help it happen, they even put teeth into it, say, we will arrest you for trying to do it. Fabulous. This is boldness that is rarely seen today, unfortunately. So I'm going to pick on this gentleman for a moment. I used to like him. He convinced me to be a neocon years ago, before I knew what a neocon was. Some of you that listen to him every once in a while, you may have noticed he often attacks those of opposing views that are supposedly conservative. Yeah, there you go. The guy has a voice for silent films and the manners of a grade school bully. But despite that, he's always attacking other conservatives that disagree with him as being a neocon without ever defining the term, because he is one. He is absolutely a neoconservative. And in my 4th lecture in the lecture series, I go into great detail of letting the neocons themselves define what neoconservatism is. As you get into that, you'll recognize, yeah, that is Mark Levin. That's for another day. Again, I'm just giving you teasers here for other lectures. But a couple of years ago, on his show, he first talks about pushing this Article 5 convention, and he says, Madison even talked about the Article 5 convention in letters to, and then lists letters that Madison wrote to all these different people, implying that Madison was really excited about this Article 5 convention idea, and he never quoted any of those letters. Because every one of them was, don't use the Article 5 convention, this is a very dangerous idea. There were states who were wanting to get the Bill of Rights through an Article 5 convention, and Madison stopped it. And one of my favorite letters was one to Jefferson, where he writes, friends of the Constitution are fixed in opposition to another convention. Those who have opposed the convention, on the other hand, are zealous for another convention. And there are others who have the insidious view of subverting the Constitution itself by having an Article 5 convention. So Madison clearly felt if we call for an Article 5 convention, it could undermine or even get rid of our entire Constitution. And he wrote that in so many words in at least a dozen letters that Levin referenced as support for it. Either he's a fool or he's a liar. I'm not sure which. He's either, maybe he never read. He's referencing all these letters he's never read. I guess that's possible. Or he's just trying to pull one over on his own audience. But then he follows that up with saying, and when it comes to nullification, Madison said, you can't do that. Does that kind of sound like him? His nasally, whiny voice, it's kind of grating, but you know. And that's all he says. When it comes to nullification, Madison said you can't do that. Really? How many of you are familiar with Thomas Woods? A number of years ago, Thomas Woods challenged Levin. Thomas Woods wrote a great book on nullification. Great book. And he challenged Levin to a debate on nullification and said, I'm going to put a $10,000 wager. We'll come to an agreement on one way or another to judge the debate, and whomever loses the debate must donate $10,000 to the organization of the opponent's choice. And Levin never responded, but when one of his supporters wrote into him saying, that's great, Tom Woods just challenged you to debate him on nullification, you should take him up on this debate, you'd wipe the floor with him. The response was they blocked that supporter. which caused him to write to Tom Woods and say, I have no idea who you are, but it sounds like I probably ought to learn who you are, because Levin sure didn't like that idea. Anyway, interesting. So they perpetuate this common myth that sure, Madison early on supported nullification, but later in life he changed his mind and was avidly against nullification. And I want you to read what he has to say here and see if it sounds like it. Of course, again, this is from 1798. This is his earlier views that in the case of overstepping the Constitution, to keep it short, the states have the right and are in duty bound to interpose and to preserve the Constitution. Okay, so he clearly supported it at that time. But what about this statement? August of 1834, Madison says, nullification has the effect of putting gunpowder, is what he's referring to, under the Constitution and the Union, and a match in the hand of every party to blow them up at pleasure. Does that sound like he's supporting nullification? No. So when they shared that quote, does that prove that he opposed nullification? No. Who could defend this? Is anyone ready to defend it right now? Yeah. Okay. I won't call on you, but just we have a couple that feel like they could. There's one simple question.
South Carolina.
What's that?
What was happening in the context of 1834 in South Carolina?
Yes, and that's exactly where we're going. What type of nullification was he opposing? Oh, wait, you mean there are more than one type? Yes. The nullification as advocated by South Carolina was the context here. And he, Madison, very clearly differentiates between the two as we get into it here. The offsprings of the discontents of South Carolina were part of his letter here, putting in context what he's referring to. This is what I refer to as Calhounian nullification versus Jeffersonian nullification. Let's define for you what Calhounian nullification is. Calhounian nullification, the bizarre theory that one state, South Carolina in this case, could, number one, nullify a trade tariff. Are tariffs constitutional? Yes. They are. Not by the president, by the way. The president doesn't have the power to impose tariffs. No reason I'm saying that in particular. Just random thoughts. Yes. Constitutional power here. So the founders only advocated nullification against unconstitutional usurpation. So that's strike one. Number two, in so doing, one state could prevent all the other states from observing this tariff. Can one state tell other states what to do through its nullification and bind them?
It was on the coast.
Yeah. One of many, though. Yeah. And then three, they said, unless and until the states gather in a convention and with a 3/4 majority overrule the nullification of South Carolina. Where does that come from? They made that up. There's no foundation for that at all. That's just clearly made it up. That's Calhounian nullification. One state can choose to nullify anything they want to, constitutional or not, and bind all the other states to it until the 3/4 of the states overrule them. Is that something you can see would put powder under the Union and the Constitution and a match in the hand of everyone to blow them up at pleasure? Absolutely. That does give the power of any one state to really destroy the entire Union. Do you see why Madison said it that way? He's absolutely right. I totally agree with him. But on this topic, Madison spoke about both Jeffersonian nullification and Calhounian because they are different. And so when you have an ignorant person pushing against nullification saying Madison changed his mind and using this powder under the Union quote, which form of nullification was he talking about there? Calhounian or nullification or Jeffersonian nullification? And they'll look at you blank-eyed. What? What's that? Calhounian. They won't even know there's a difference or what Calhounian is or how bizarre it was. But in this letter in 1834, December, Madison begins by defining and talking about Jeffersonian nullification. Quoting Jefferson first, saying, "But where powers are assumed that have not been delegated, every state has a natural right in cases not within the Constitution, the compact, to nullify. And then he gives commentary on Jefferson's quote. He says, thus, the right of nullification meant by Jefferson is the natural right, which all admit, except Levin, to be a remedy against insupportable oppression. Is he against nullification here? Not at all.
He's defining his terms.
He's defining his terms, exactly. So the right of nullification meant by Jefferson. Jefferson nullification is the natural right that we all agree is a remedy against insupportable oppression. And then right after that, he defines, it cannot be supposed for a moment that Mr. Jefferson would not revolt at the doctrine of South Carolina, Calhonian nullification, that a single state could constitutionally resist a law of the Union while remaining in it, and that with the ascension of a small minority of others could overrule the will of the great majority of the whole and constitutionally annul the law everywhere. Calhonian nullification defined. And saying even Jefferson would revolt at that. While at the same time, Madison is endorsing nullification in the same breath, isn't he? As long as it's Jeffersonian. See the great lengths they go to lie to us? So my conclusion for today is this. The only reason to oppose nullification is if you don't want the Constitution enforced. Is that a fair assessment? Why would Levin not want the Constitution enforced? That's pretty indicting, actually, to even say that.
Well, he wrote the book to have 11 different reasons whether we want to amend the Constitution.
Yeah.
So he's for constitutional change.
But you have to have enough chaos to get the people willing to risk a convention. If we start enforcing the Constitution, then what would happen to their movement to change the Constitution? It would die. If nullification grows enough, it should die, you're right. They would have no grounds to say we need to risk the Constitution to change us. And poor Mark Meckler would lose his $500,000 a year he's getting from Convention of States. Never mind on that. The last example I want to use is this one, the Real ID Act. The Real ID Act of, yeah, thank you. The Real ID Act of 2005. 2005 it was passed. And for those that have been on the airlines much over the last 20 years, you've seen signs like this
2 months left.
again and again saying you got 6 months, you got 3 months. Any states that are that don't have Real ID will no longer be able to fly on the airlines, and then the date comes along and they put up a new sign with a new date. They've been doing that for 20 years, and it finally got implemented in May of 2025 because of this person. Who's that? Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem, who is supposedly a great conservative, and yet she's the one that revived the otherwise dead Real ID Act and got it enforced.
That's me flying without Real ID.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, hi.
Show them the law.
I'll let you guys can come look at this after if you'd like. I'll leave it up here and I appreciate that. Can I keep that?
You may.
Awesome. Thank you.
Got a dozen of them in my bag.
I offended a lot of my friends who think she's a great conservative. I took that picture, which I took in the TSA line, and added a small little black mustache to it. They really didn't like that. They thought, how dare you speak out against this great conservative? I'm saying she's implementing tyranny.
Yes.
The Real ID Act, why had it not been implemented for 20 years? Because shortly after it was passed, 12 states said no. We will not be implementing the Real ID Act, and we will arrest federal agents, some of them said, including Montana, who tried to enforce this. And then by the time they got to the next deadline, it was up to 28 states. And then little by little, through the back door, the government kept threatening and bribing the states to give in and whittling them down one by one until we just had a handful of states left. And then Kristi Noem finally just said, okay, it's time.
So how did she actually make it to be law? What did she do?
How did she implement the law? Ultimately just saying, we are now going to enforce this.
Oh, she just
And the reason they couldn't before that was Among the popular federal agencies, TSA isn't really up at the top of the list, or on the list at all. And so they recognized they didn't have the political capital to stand up against 28 states saying no. If that came to a head-to-head, 28 states saying no, and the federal government saying you're not allowed to fly on the airlines, that would be national news, and the battle would be one they would lose on popularity. But once they whittled it down to just a few states that were still standing their ground, they could now push them over. 1 or 2 states can't stand up to the federal government.
Missouri was the last one.
Yeah. So that's the battle of the Real ID Act. There's a hand back here.
What gets me is we have to go through all